NATO set up sort of multinational tripwire forces in the Baltic states and Poland that are basically meant to be a signal to Russia that if you come for these countries, you are coming for nuclear armed powers and it's going to get very messy.
So, Oliver, what are you hearing about how concerned NATO and its member governments are about Donald Trump's imminent return to the White House?
Well, in public, NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte insisted on a visit to Latvia this week, that he had a good working relationship with Trump, that Trump completely understood how central NATO was to defending the US as well as Europe. And NATO officials also insist off the record that they're pretty confident that Trump, if it came to an emergency situation, could be counted on to come to the defense of his allies. But the view from a lot of European capitals, including Berlin, where I'm sitting right now, is very different. They're concerned not only that Trump will throw Kiev under the bus and broker or impose some kind of peace deal that'd be very favorable to Vladimir Putin, but also they're concerned about remarks Trump has made in the past about how he would let the Russians do whatever the hell they want to allies that he feels are not spending enough on their own defense and therefore effectively robbing the US taxpayer.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, actually, isn't it? Because I also understand that the Dutch Prime Minister has said that while he thinks the alliance can withstand challenges, Europe would have to invest more in its armed forces. Is there a sort of widespread understanding that that might be a reality for Europe, not just coming from Trump, but coming from inside Europe as well?
The contrarian case that is made by some European commentators about Trump's re-election is that this is probably a net good thing, in the sense that it is finally the unarguable external shock that Europe has needed to get its act together on defense spending. Collectively, the European allies are up to an average of about 2% of GDP on their military budgets, which is the NATO target. But the conversation has now moved on. Trump's talking about 3%. The allies on the eastern flank, the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, the Latvians, are spending anything from sort of 3.5 to upwards of 5%. So the goalposts have really shifted.
Right. So tell us about this exercise, Resolute Warrior, that's going on right now. What is it and where is it happening?
Resolute Warrior is the first exercise of this new NATO multinational brigade in Latvia that is led by Canada. So, in the past, after the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014, NATO set up sort of multinational tripwire forces in the Baltic states and Poland that are basically meant to be a signal to Russia that if you come for these countries, you are coming for nuclear armed powers and it's going to get very messy. But there's been a realization since the full scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 that that is no longer enough of a deterrent, that they need serious military force on the ground. So, what we've seen in Latvia is this NATO force of about 1,500 soldiers has more than doubled in size. It's now about 3,400 soldiers, 1,000 combat and support vehicles. So this was the first time that they were really kind of properly put into action. They come from more than a dozen different countries. So getting these people with different languages, different training traditions, different military doctrines, different kinds of kit to work together is a bit of a challenge.
So, is this essentially a mock battle for the Baltic without the support of America?
Yeah, because it is also the first large NATO exercise since Trump's re-election, and there are no US troops taking part. You could look at it as almost a foretaste of what the defense of Europe might look like without American support, albeit on a pretty small scale. The opposing force is played by elements of the British army, and it's basically just kind of land warfare that resembles in a lot of ways the kind of fighting that we've been seeing in Ukraine.
Right. So, what are these forces tacked to achieve or defend in this mock battle?
So the Brits playing the invaders had been tasked with basically strangling Riga, the Latvian capital. and the battle takes place over about a third of Latvia's land area. So it's a really serious piece of chunk of territory. And the NATO defenders are trying to seize what they think might be kind of strategic objectives for the Brits, things like airfields and so on, and to kind of just hold the line and make sure that they can get the ammunition and the fuel back up to the front, to direct the artillery fire onto the invaders and so forth, much as they would in a real conflict scenario.
Right. How much of this exercise is about training and sort of practicing for what might be a new reality, and how much is it about symbolism?
It's a bit of both, right? I mean, the fact that you have all of these very diverse national forces here does mean that they're going to be very hard to gel together into an effective fighting force unless they are really kind of tested under kind of realistic conditions. But at the same time, this is also obviously about sending a signal to Russia that not only is NATO there and trained, but it's also under the new regional defense plans prepared to fight right from the borders if there is a Russian invasion. So instead of just kind of being there symbolically, they would be expected to put up a serious military resistance.
Mm. On that note, I mean, do you think there's any chance that Russia might be tempted to actually test NATO's defences? While there are these questions going on about America's willingness to step in and defend Europe.
I mean, Russia has been testing NATO's defenses for years in terms of electronic warfare. They've been jamming GPS signals over the Baltic region in terms of sabotage, in terms of assassination attempts. So we're talking about really about the kind of point where this starts to escalate to a level where you could describe it as a direct military conflict. And the concern here is that so much of Europe's ability to deter a Russian invasion hinges on the belief that the US could be counted on in extremis to come in with nuclear missiles if it comes to it. And if Trump has suggested, not that he's going to take the US out of NATO, but that he wouldn't necessarily be prepared to deliver on that guarantee, then that might create enough doubt in the mind of the Kremlin that it would think, okay, we have an opportunity here to exploit these political divisions in the alliance and maybe just kind of test the boundaries a bit in terms of putting, some paramilitary troops over the border into Estonia or something like that.
Mm. Now, NATO got a new member this year in the form of Sweden. Are they involved in any way?
They're not involved in this exercise. However, in January, if their parliament agrees, and I think it will, they are going to send in a mechanized infantry battalion. So that's about 1,000 troops to this brigade in Latvia. And I'm pretty sure that would be the first time Sweden has made a serious military deployment in the framework of an alliance since 1812.
Wow.
And interestingly enough, back then they were at war with the British.
Right. Before I let you go and get on with your weekend, Oliver, I just wanted to ask you about Olaf Scholz's phone call with Putin, which one of the lines coming out of this is saying that it opens a Pandora's box, according to Zelensky. What do we know about this phone call? Like, we know they haven't spoken in nearly 2 years, so this call is fascinating in its timing. What do we know and how's it going down?
The readouts from both the German Chancellery and the Kremlin suggest that it was basically just an exchange of formalities. Scholz condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine, telling Putin to pull his troops back, end the war, show a serious readiness to negotiate for what he called a just and stable peace, whatever that means. And the Kremlin saying, the West needs to recognize its own role in stirring up this conflict as Russia sees it. Pretty much everything that you would expect. What is interesting here is that Scholz coordinated this call very closely with allies, including Poland and also Ukraine. He spoke to Zelensky both before and after the call, so he's very keen to give the impression that he is not stepping out of line with the rest of the West. That said, Zelensky has come out and criticized it very strongly because he is very allergic to anything that resembles the West trying to reach a rapprochement with Russia over his head. And a lot of critics argued that there was basically no point to this call from Scholz's perspective. He just wants to reach out to his potential voters ahead of the Bundestag election in February and project this image of the Chancellor of Peace, the guy who is putting diplomatic effort into trying to resolve the conflict.